It's a great pleasure to have so many people joining us. This is proving to be one of the more popular topics that we'll be covering in our webinar series. I'm sure the title caught everyone's attention. The end is near, and it probably doesn't come as a surprise to many. Firstly, we'd certainly like to acknowledge that we're in an environment of unprecedented change, especially over the last 24 months. I'd also like to congratulate those on the line for your ongoing interest in this. And the sentiment that we're seeing is that so many advisors and AFSLs these days feel like they're coming to the end of the tunnel and can start to see some light. One of the I guess, last challenges on top of FOFA examinations and the like is how the industry will deal with the end of grandfathered commissions. Today, we're going to cover some of the basics and some of the communication that we think might help you with that. So let's get started. I've got a little bit to cover. Firstly, we want to provide real clarity around the issues associated with this and to give you an insight to the journey that we've all been on. I'd like to give you confidence, address some of the concerns that advisors and AFSLs have had, also look at how this turns into an opportunity for growth and how businesses and charging might be optimised, and also talking about the role that managed accounts may play in dealing with grandfathered commissions. There's a fair bit to cover, so I'll be moving quite quickly, but I better get underway. Okey-dokey, here we go. So we thought we'd start with a brief history lesson. Before we kick off and talk about this and why this is an important part of the conversation, is that in my research on this topic, there hasn't been a great narrative available and a history lesson that advisors and dealers can use that talk about the journey as to why we are where we are. So this slide, I hope, provides some context and may even be used as a tool to talk to clients and broader interested parties about how we ended up at this point where in 2021, I'll talk about this in a moment, there's an end coming through to grandfathered commissions. So to start with, grandfathered commissions, the quantity and magnitude of the change can't be underestimated. So it's been estimated by advisor ratings that there is nearly $1 billion of conflicted revenue that advisors are receiving through ongoing trials and the like. The change that we're seeing, which will occur in 2021, will result in $1 billion of revenue, if not treated, being lost to advisors' bottom lines. Now that is significant. That doesn't mean it just goes, it means there's an opportunity for change, and we'll talk about what that means. To talk about conflicted remuneration and what is grandfathered commissions, I thought I'd go back to some of the basics in the research so everyone's on the same page. And the definition that's coming through on grandfathering is to exempt something or someone from a new law or regulation. And that's what has been happening over the last number of years. In the financial advice context, grandfathering concerns ongoing payments from within a super fund or insurance account that's usually paid to a financial advisor. It's also the accounting of these payments are often found in older style legacy products. So we're seeing that this is impacting a number of advisors and investors that have had a long history. We're also seeing that this was exempted through the FOFA legislation some 5 years ago. The grandfathered commissions payments are actually paid from the fees or the MER that is coming out of a client's account. The thing to note was that in this history that the actual payment was actually a form of defraying distribution costs. And in some cases, advisors or companies were using this to reward advisors for the ongoing administration and servicing of their clients, which they were not willing to take on. And if we actually start at the far left of this timeline, it's important to give the context around why this started. And there's kind of different lenses that are being applied to this, as in, this is a bad thing and how did we end up here? The reality is, it's more about the journey we've been on and the change in the industry that we're facing now. If I can ask those to step back, I'm sure there's a few people who were around in the early 80s as advisors. If we think about the history, the first thing that we saw was the introduction of managed investment schemes. And they were offered obviously by financial institutions who wanted to start marketing managed investments. And they wanted to obviously make that available so investors could access markets and investments through pooling of their money. The managers in those early days had no sales forces. They didn't have a means to sell the concept. And of course, they didn't have client service organisations. So it was very much the turning of institutional asset management into retail. And most importantly, they had no real way to communicate to investors who ultimately were starting to access their investments. So this was the starting point of trail commissions being paid out of management investment fees. It wasn't an added fee on top, it was actually taken out of the MERs. It was deducted from the investor's account. And it didn't actually look like a specific debit. So there was a key point, which is there was a purpose, which was for supporting advisors to distribute and service managed funds in the early days, but there was not actually discrete disclosure. And it's important to remember back at this stage, investment managers didn't really want relationships directly with investors. And also in those earlier days, the concept of managers being direct to clients was actually pretty well frowned upon by advisors. They wanted to be the intermediaries in that relationship. So we saw in the 80s, late 80s, that there was this environment. In 1990 through to 1998, we really started to see the first signs of vertical integration. And you could see there that the banks recognised the profit opportunities of not only owning asset management, but advice delivery, and ultimately through the introduction of platforms. They could see triple layers of revenue coming through, where they could derive profits from asset management, platform fees, advisor services as well. This period of vertical integration actually created a further opaque nature to the disclosure of fees and the understanding of whether subsidisation or conflicts were occurring. We also saw that during this period there was a mushrooming of the size of the superannuation market, whereby 1992 was of not huge consequence to where it grew to today, being nearly a $2.8 trillion asset pool. So the backdrop of growth and the backdrop of the vertical integration and the changes in who owned what was really what we were dealing with. And it's quite interesting today, we're seeing the unravelling of that now in 2018 as the divestment of major banks from wealth and asset management ownership. During this period of time, there were changes happening, and of course the impost for compliance and legal services were also increasing, and we started to see real cost increases to advisors. And it became apparent that the trailing commissions or the commissions being paid from clients out of products were not enough to fully cost or to cover the cost of operating advice businesses. And this is where we saw the introduction of ongoing advice fees, which was the first sign of more transparent ongoing advice fees. So you had a combination of embedded trailing commission attached also with ongoing advice fees. And you would see the difference there where you'd have a discrete line item on the client statement. At this stage, there was a change going on where we started to see advisors and AFSLs rebate the trails, start to move towards institutional or wholesale offers, so that the advice fees became fully transparent. Now that change wasn't adopted by everyone, and for many cases there were system limitations or product limitations and dealer group limitations. So we are where we are as far as that change. When you think about that journey, we also had the introduction of Bernie, and that I'm talking about in Bernie Fraser. Along came Bernie in 1998, and it was the catalyst for a real battle beginning, and that was where the industry funds had effectively decided to combine the largest 5 industry funds' marketing budgets together to put a super pool together of advertising campaigns that started to talk about and put pressure on the ongoing advice fees that were being charged in retail superannuation in particular. The introduction of the compare the pair ads kicked off at that period. It's worth noting we're now in the 3rd generation of these ads, and it is still some of the most significant industry advertising and lobbying that is actually undertaken throughout the industry. In 1998 through to 2013, as a background, we saw a push for reforms coming through, and we saw Labor taking government from 2007 through to 2013, and the introduction of a package of reform measures, which was actually a ban of upfront commissions and trails on new investments. Super funds had to invest in new super contributions into low-cost investments. FDSs were introduced, a whole range of those. And there was also a key date for introduction of 1 July 2013 for many of these measures to come in. And there was different grace periods and implementations that were there. And we heard the first time about the grandfathering of ongoing commissions here. You'd think all was normal, but then of course you have a change of government, and the true grandfathering and in some cases what was described as watering down or rollbacks of some of these changes added to the confusion in the mind of advisors and clients and how this was to be treated. So during this period of change, we acknowledged that the grandfathering existed, and the catalyst for the final change that we're seeing at the moment was at 2019. And we saw that through the introduction of the Royal Commission into Financial Services, chaired by Kenneth Hayne. And one of the key recommendations that came out of that was recommendation 2.4, which was on grandfathered commissions. And that was that it was seen as a high priority recommendation to, as soon as practicable, to change these and to bring into law a change that would see the end of grandfathering and trails. So on the 30th of July, the coalition government introduced the legislation, and as we would now see, it is now law. And the legislation that will end grandfathered commissions has actually passed on both sides, or both houses of the federal parliament under the reforms. So we see that Treasury Law's amendment ending grandfathering was actually enacted and introduced and has been passed. The law comes into effect on 2021 practically. There is, however, challenges taking place by various groups in the market. One of those that's been quite vocal around this is the AOIFP, whereby it is assumed a challenge will be mounted to see this changed. The reality of what is happening from not only a law perspective, but the pushback and now what is happening at an industry level is now just starting to take place. So we saw one of the largest groups in Australia through the CFS group announce over the last week or so through one of their spokespeople, confirming the institution does actually plan to phase out grandfathered commissions. They'd made steps with this with their own internal advisory network. But instead of waiting for the January 2021 date, there was a call out that this would be happening sometime before that. So there is a risk now that you'll see institutions who will be required to implement and enact up to this point move this forward. Some of the changes for this is that if you have institutions choosing to move before the January 2020 the January 2021 date, the time horizon for advisors and licensees to react has shortened. So if you were thinking the date that you had was to the January 2021, the industry is tending to now look like it is moving faster than expected. So there is certainly a changing view post-Royal Commission, and I think I won't go into Bob Dylan songs, but I think this was certainly clear that the times they are changing immediately. And we've seen this interest through our ongoing conversations with dealer groups and advisors about So if it's happening quickly, have I got enough time and what can I do? And today we'll explore that in more detail. Through our conversations, we've run a number of working groups over the period to talk about what some of the potential impacts and responses might be from various groups. And if you think on the left-hand side of this slide, glass half empty, probably a more black hat view of what's occurring, versus a more half full potential response. How do we find a way through these things? We'll talk through each of these separately. So what are some of the potential impacts? So I stated earlier, there's $1 billion of revenue that is currently sitting in advisor bottom lines as profit in conflicted rem that will disappear, but that is if it's untreated. So the potential response that we're seeing is that that number probably won't automatically disappear off advisor bottom lines. We're seeing that the treatment will probably see it more like 50% of that number, and that there's an active campaign of advisors repricing to replace what will soon be conflicted remuneration to more transparent ongoing advice fees in whichever form that might take. We are certainly seeing a restructure of revenue models, and we're seeing that at not only the advisor but the platform level and product level, where there is a flurry of activity, especially in the last 6 months, with the introduction of more naked pricing. And we've seen that with platforms and asset managers really now talking about the removal of promoter fees, distribution fees and the like. So we certainly have seen that as a provider in the market. There's been a disruption to the operation and profitability of practices, but that has been also as a backdrop to many practices swapping groups as the larger banks have divested their wealth investments. The disruption of profitability has also seen some falling in business valuations, and I'll provide you with some statistics in a moment. But what we are seeing is continued falling of business valuations and forced sales at discounts. And I won't comment on the active conversations with the broader AMP groups, but that is probably a microcosm of what is actually happening more broadly, where traditional views around the valuations of the business are certainly being reset. We're seeing advisors exiting the industry on top of higher education standards and a backdrop of revenue challenges through these changes. We're seeing a lot of change come about the composition and the number of advisors in the market. On this point, there's been many statistics about whether there'll be 50%, 40%, 20% of advisors leave the industry. I would encourage you to go and look at some of the changes that happened in the UK, some probably 6 or 7 years ago when they had a regulatory change there. And that equalisation came back to being somewhere less than 20% reduction in advisors over a period of time, and now a rekindling and a regrowth in advisor numbers. So what seems challenging now is actually seeing a regeneration in other areas. I'll move to some of the issues in the last probably 4 points, and that is that what are we seeing? More transparent pricing of dealer services. We've seen that some conflicted remuneration has actually supported revenue lines of dealers. We now see greater transparency of that, where dealers are now competing on much more even playing fields, and advisors are making more critical decisions around what are the real services and what is being paid for. And I'd take my hat off to a number of the groups that we deal with that have really stood up to this challenge and now feel like that their value propositions are being far more well understood with transparent pricing of services. The last point I'll cover on this slide is the closure of legacy products, and this is one where I think that the various industry bodies are calling out for unintended consequences. When this date ticks over and you think about the legacy systems that are sometimes 30 years old, that are trained to pay trail commissions, that are trained not to pass through cash rebates to clients, there is going to be a flurry of change. And some of the unintended consequences that will come out of that will be felt. So I think there's some from a product provider level as well as what advisors will see. Some of the industry have talked about the fact that the cash rebates that will be coming back to clients may actually be a reason for changes of how their pension entitlements are actually calculated. So they'll be getting new income coming into their accounts that may be affecting them. The last point, which is the emergence of managed accounts, which has really been happening for the last 5 years, we see is a significant response and a positive response to delivering transparency, lower costs, and more advisor efficiency, and I'll delve into that more deeply shortly. I wanted to pull out a couple of items on the advisor revenue impacts, and the advisor revenue impacts, there's some excellent work that has been done by Core Data. This slide can look a little tricky, but I just wanted to talk through how it is to be interpreted. So if you bear with me for one moment. This was a survey, and as you'll see from the top there, it was a survey of a significant number of advisors, some 647 advisors, where they were asked approximately what proportion of your practice revenue is grandfathered or conflicted remuneration. And this slide covers a category. There's 5 categories of how you could complete this. There was 0% of my practice, 1 to 10%, 11 to 40%, 41 to 70%, and 71 to 100%. So there's one matrix happening there, which is what percentage of your practice revenue is conflicted. So there's a category that just said 0. That's the first one. Then as you head down, it broke it into different cohorts, which were, are you independently owned, affiliated with an institution, or institutionally branded, and then an overall average. When you look at this and you think, oh, there's not some, if you have nearly 35.1% of independently owned saying, okay, well, those have said 0%, the averages aren't so bad. But if you move to the next slide, you'll see if you remove that first cohort, which is those who just said there is no issue. And if you think about those advisors who might have no issue, some might be more recent entrance to the market. They might not have the older clients. They might have a longer tail might not have the longer tail of clients and larger businesses. So we've removed one section of this. And then the question is, approximately what proportion of your practice revenue is grandfathered or conflicted remuneration? And when you look at this and you're saying, well, 10% or less of my practice revenue is conflicted, and 63.2% of independently owned AFSL said it could be up to be 10% is conflicted remuneration. When you think about that, that is a guarantee that on January 2021, that 10% of that revenue will disappear. Any business that has a 10% fall of revenue, it will be felt. If you then actually think about the next cohort, which is, oh, well, I'm independently owned, but somewhere around 11 to 40% of my revenue is conflicted. 24% of independently owned IFA said that is going to be a problem to me. And finally, you'll see there that some advisors or a cohort where they said nearly 41 to 70% of my revenue is actually conflicted. You can see it's a smaller proportion, but it's a bigger impact to those groups. So what this is telling us when you look at the various ways to slice and dice this is that averages make it seem not a big issue. When you delve into individual businesses and what we've seen, there are some significant issues. It's almost polarizing where some say it's not even an issue, others say this is something that I'm having to deal with. To support this argument, and I'll just skip this slide quickly, but to support this argument, you can see this playing out in practice valuations, and this is provided through Fort Asset Solutions with Steve Prendeville. And the sale of practices and the values of recurring revenue are already being felt. And we're seeing there that a practice that is heavily laden with grandfathered revenue is selling at close to 1 times its recurring revenue. A financial planning practice with a 35% of the clients, over 70 plus, somewhere less at, somewhere more as a multiple at 2.5 times. And then clients that are broken down, which is a financial planning practice that you consider a general business, is going for around about a 2.5 to 3 times. And that's assuming, that top one, that's assuming that the conflicted revenue or the conflicted remuneration is well in hand and probably falls into the lower percentages of impact. So business values are being driven down depending on how well this is being dealt with. What is important to note, though, is that we still have time on our hands to improve the revenue composition of practices and find a solution forward. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of what might a successful transition away from grandfather or conflicted remuneration might look like. We've broken this down into really 5 areas, and I'll fly through these and touch on the last one in a bit more detail. The first thing that we've said here is take control. The second area is you need a new lens on pricing about the old world versus new world, trying to find what's efficient, valuable advice and how it's perceived, looking at how the value chain could be reconstructed, and then finally finding the right partners and people who can help you on that. The first point of taking control, this has been one of the most emotional topics that's come up, and the thing that we have said is clear thinking and putting aside how you feel and about some of the criticism that's coming is key. That's why I gave you that long history. This is just where we are. It's not an indictment of good or bad, so we have to put that aside. The second point is that the shift may be closer and quicker than anticipated, and we saw that through some of those announcements that came out last week on CFS. This is not I will get to it in 6 months' time, it's a here and now conversation. The decision to transition to a future model does have to take place now, but there are options. For many advisors, the efforts of moving clients away from conflicted remuneration versus just letting it stop and run off might be a viable option. So we see that thinking about active involvement now, but making a decision whether you will or won't act, does actually have to take place sooner rather than later. New lenses on pricing that we're seeing, and this is from some of the workshops that we've been running, is that thinking about reviewed pricing through the client lens. Who are the target clients that I'm after, and where do I deliver value? Thinking about the cost to serve versus historically what they've paid. A lot of clients who are paying large ongoing trail commissions, in some ways there's a rethinking of the value that is being actually delivered and the revenue that's being received on that point. So thinking about, is there enough value being shown for the service being delivered? Is what is being delivered valued by the client? And also this role of being a coach and a mentor remains okay. However, these days it is not enough. It has to be documented, it has to mean something, it has to be actually calculated as value. Repricing clients on a revenue basis is absolutely a trend that we are seeing, and we're seeing advisors unfortunately recognise that there's just some clients that previously that they were being supported, able to support through trailing commissions, who are no longer economic going forward. And this last point, which is 48% of practices surveyed are now doing this as their number one priority. So nearly 50% of the industry is in the depths of repricing. There's a whole range of tools and work that can be done. The Hub Business Development team can certainly help through some of the tools that we've put together, which helps advisors rethink around the value of advice and how you can represent what is valuable to clients. The key principles that we try and work with advisors on are ensuring that the advice is efficient, which is obviously what we work with being a platform provider and a leader in managed accounts, that it's valuable and what a client's needs, and the transparency that is delivered, which we think our managed accounts provide an exceptional solution for. The change that I talked about on repricing, I'll briefly touch on this. This is from core data. Best way to read this is the 2017 is the very light blue. In 2017, repricing of clients, only 27.5% of advisors saw that as being the number one thing that they wanted to undertake. In 2019, which is really where we are now, as mentioned, 48.5% of advisors said that is the number one priority in their business, which is get my pricing right and deal with these issues. So we know that there's a lot of interest and a lot of change taking place. In the last couple of minutes, I'll talk about a practical example of how you might want to think about reconstructing the value chain that exists. The example I have here is only indicative, but it is fairly relevant to a practice that we worked with that talks about what the real costs are and how the conflicted remuneration in some products does work. So you would see there that some clients might be paying a gross product fee of around 2.66%. And these are often multi-manager solutions, some of the older solutions that we see. More often than not, that original structure of 2.66% became quite dated, and you saw that the investment management component of that product was being rebated back to a degree. And you're seeing investment rebates come back at around circa 1.05%. So when you worked against or put those right backs in, you saw that the client's ongoing costs and product fees were around 1.61%. Of that 1.61%, there was a manager administration expense ratio of around 1.01%, and embedded in that 1.6% was probably an advisor trail of about 60 basis points. I talked earlier about how the fact that 60 basis points was not usually enough to see an advisor run a profitable business. So advisor service fees came in at 0.34. And then you had a client paying a total net cost in fees of around 1.95%. Where we see the unbundling of this composition and the opportunity is through the use of contemporary platforms like Hub24 and the use of managed accounts, and of course some of the lower cost investment solutions. Platform fees, and some of the recent surveys are showing after aggregation and after volume is considered platform fees at some stages working at around 30 basis points on average for clients, but there's some caveats around that. Manager MERs on platforms are certainly sitting around 60 basis points, but the concept of investment rebates coming back to clients is alive and well, and we're seeing that at a circa 20 basis points. You're seeing advisors still seeking to earn around 94 to 100 basis points in ongoing advice fee, but obviously that is a consented ongoing advice fee and very transparent. What you then end up with is this unbundled offer of a discrete platform fee, a discrete manager fee with clear rebates going to clients, and a transparent ongoing advice fee. You have the opportunity with contemporary platforms and managed accounts to provide not only transparency, an improved service proposition, a new degree of reporting and opportunity for clients, and that cost can very feasibly come in at 1.64%. The ability to move a client away from a bundled fee composition and the conflicted remuneration, which shows transparency and delivers a potential saving to them in their pocket of 30 basis points, is alive and well, is an opportunity that can be pursued. However, as I mentioned, the time is running, the clock is ticking as we speak. I hope that example gives a feel. We are actively involved in this on many occasions with advisors and dealers throughout the industry. We think we have a very strong formula to help people with that and understand the real costs. The one thing I'd like to leave you with is these final points. Take control, be clear about the advisor remuneration. There's new benefits that are available to your clients, and we believe it can add real business value and actually improve the value of your practices over time. Thank you very much for your time. I know we covered a lot of ground. This will be posted on the Hub site. And of course, we're now open for questions.
Great, thanks Greg. Just a reminder to everybody to use your webinar control panel to send through questions to Greg, and we'll pop them up here for him to answer. So Greg, we've got a couple that have come through. What is the most common response you're seeing among practices with repricing and the exploration of managed accounts or managed portfolios?
Certainly. The most common approach is first engaging with the dealer and taking counsel from the dealers that we have. What we are also seeing, though, is that a definite pause in business operation to think about the repricing of the advice model. And I think that is actually the major response, which is, are my services valued, and are there clients I can no longer afford to deal with? And of course, the last part of that was, does digital advice play into account?
Great, thank you. We've had another one come through. Once grandfather commissions have been eliminated, will advisors need to renegotiate an advisor fee?
So once a grandfather commission has been eliminated, will advisors need to renegotiate an advisor fee? Yes, they will. I think that is the absolute key, which is there is a conversation. Assuming this happens, that a conflicted remuneration stops, what happens? It is no longer paid to the AFSL, it is no longer passed through to the advisor, it is effectively rebated back to the client account as cash. So the renegotiation becomes, nothing needs to change really for the client. They end up with a benefit. If the advisor then wants a new fee, or a fee that they were previously receiving, yes, it's sit down and have an advice conversation. There's another question here which relates to, are you seeing the 0.94% advisor fee being capped or reduced for higher balances? It is usually capped, and I think that advisors are recognising there's a real cost to running their business, so they recognise that if you're dealing with, $5–10 million clients, the ability to charge on a percentage fee is very difficult. So I guess in answering that in the second part, high balance clients certainly have different fees coming through, but the focus on strategic advice and holistic advice really does see some advisors in positions with clients that the revenue they're receiving for clients is far more than they've ever received. So the change is certainly coming through, but there is just so much change in the way advisors are charging that high-low, mid-value clients are certainly getting different fee structures. The biggest change is how our digital advice models go to be charged for and given to clients as well. So I think there's the final part, and that pricing hasn't worked through.
Great, thanks Greg. And looks like there's one more. You mentioned there's a case being mounted against the removal of grandfather commissions. Mm-hmm. How likely do you think it is to actually be overturned?
This is a personal opinion only. I think that it will be very challenging. Would be the best way I'd put to it. There's been a groundswell. I'm not a legal expert. There might be an amazing legal case there. However, I'd say that the fact that it's passed into legislation, that's come through a very long process through a Royal Commission, I think the odds would be stacked against that being successful. So if that was the thing that you were relying upon not to act, I would think that the safer option would be to assume that it's not going to win, and that the end of grandfathering will take place, and that would be the scenario I'd be pursuing.